So welcome to the C3AI Digital Transformation Institute Colloquium Series. Our mission is to attract the world's leading scientists to join in a coordinated and innovative effort to advance the digital transformation of business, government, and society. There, as you can see, we have many illustrious universities and companies coming together and all supported by C3AI. I want to draw your attention to an upcoming research symposium. The registration link will be available on the C3AI website shortly. You can take a look at that link provided here. January 12th to 13th, 2 half days of talks by people who've been funded and are doing research through the C3AI DTI development, and additional speakers. It will be very exciting and a lot of fun, and should have a broad range of types of talks, including some very mathematical talks and some focused on sociology and applications. So I hope you'll come, and do keep an eye on our website to see how to register. We will resume with the Spring 2021 Colloquium Series starting next in January 14th, and you'll be able to continue seeing these talks. So the one thing you should know is that all of the talks are videotaped and they are now on YouTube, and you can go to there and see these at that link up here. So all of these talks are available, and this talk today will also be made available. So the way we work is that we have a 40-minute presentation. This particular presentation will have a brief question period in between some of the speakers. As you'll see, we actually have 3 speakers today. And then at the end, we will have a 15-minute Q&A. So you can save your questions for the end, or if you have some clarifying questions, you could ask in the middle. You can put your questions into the Q&A box, and they will be addressed in order in which they're received. If you see a question you really like, you can upvote it, and that will make it actually get asked earlier. And we'll answer as many questions as we can during our allotted time. So today's talk, as you can see, is about a very important question, which is eviction. And the people who are going to talk today actually understood this was going to be an issue, and we now know how much of an issue it is because of COVID-19. So Karen Chapple is one of the 3 speakers. She is a professor and chair of the City and Regional Planning Department at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley. Karen, when you come on, you can tell us about your new adventures that are going to be starting soon. The next speaker is Tim Thomas. He's a sociologist, a postdoc right now at UC Berkeley, working in the Urban Displacement Project. And the third speaker is Peter Hepburn, who is at Princeton University in the Eviction Lab. He's a statistician and demographer and a sociologist. So I'm going to pass this over now to Karen. And Karen, you can turn on your video and unmute.
Thank you so much, Tandy. Thank you for inviting us to this seminar. It's really been an honor and a privilege to participate in the Digital Transformation Institute. So today we're going to be presenting some work in progress. We've made a lot of progress, but there's a lot more to go. And we're really hoping for your feedback. And we're going to leave lots of time for discussion, hopefully, to get questions and feedback. And please feel free to email us afterwards if you have more questions. So could you go to the next slide, Tim? The US has been experiencing a rental affordability crisis that has accelerated, particularly in strong market areas and coastal metros. Now, the causes of the crisis are many, but clearly it's the failure of incomes to keep pace with housing costs that deserves most of the blame. And in some areas, there's also constraints on building new supply, resistance to more density that's also at fault. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic pushes this rental affordability crisis to a new level. Essential workers are getting sick, non-essential workers are losing their jobs, and spending overall is declining. And so many do not have the money to cover rent, or they're digging deep into their savings to do so. Typically, in a typical December, about 85% of households pay rent. This December, it was 75%. So we know the crisis is coming. What happens if you can't pay your rent? Well, you're more likely to experience displacement. And for some, it may be a forcible displacement in the form of an eviction. There's a significant literature on what happens next. Many overcrowd into the apartments of friends and family. The disruption is likely to result also in challenges for kids in school. Also creates longer commutes, job loss, health problems, stress, and more. For the lowest income, there may be a downward spiral of evictions and homelessness. From a policy perspective, we care about this because it turns out that from the public goods perspective, it's much less expensive generally to keep people in place than to let the shock of displacement and eviction play out. Stabilizing communities makes good fiscal sense. So it's not surprising that since the onset of the pandemic, the federal and state governments have passed a series of moratoria on evictions. The federal government's current ban prohibits residential landlords nationwide from evicting certain tenants through December 31st of this year. There's a significant burden of proof, however, on tenants. Currently, 16 states, including and as well as Washington, D.C. and Boston, have eviction bans, and 10 also prohibit utility cutoffs. A number of states had bans, but let them expire in June. And so we're already looking at the impacts of that. Now, what happens when the national moratorium and the state moratoria are lifted and the landlords can finally evict their tenants? Remember, landlords, many of them have their own mortgages to pay. So these evictions are likely to occur. Some call it a potential tsunami. Others expect it to be a little bit more sticky. Landlords could be reluctant to evict if it's hard to get replacement tenants. So whatever the situation, we want to be prepared. We need to identify how much instability we could experience, where it will occur, and where public resources are most effectively spent. So that's where the work of the Urban Displacement Project, led by its research director, Tim Thomas, and the Eviction Lab at Princeton, with this project led by Rutgers sociologist Peter Hepburn, is so important. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Karen. I assume that everyone can hear me. Just to kind of highlight again what the goals of the project are in particular is we're looking at neighborhood level characteristics that might be able to show us where populations that are precarious might exist. So we're exploring where this is happening by looking at precarity as a function of the risk of displacement. This is like informal moves or forced moves. We're also looking at the risk of eviction. And we're also looking at the risk of unemployment, which is a very high predictor of eviction. We call this assessment the housing precarity risk model, here developed at UC Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project. After my talk, Peter Hepburn will speak about measuring real-time changes in eviction patterns to assess immediate need and shifts in displacement patterns. So the Eviction Tracking System is also part of the C3.ai DTI grant that we are teaming with them, and we are collaborating together to look at this issue. Now, just real briefly, I want to just position us to understand what is displacement. Real quickly, we can think about displacement or mobility in general as this kind of smiley graph here. On the bottom side, on the x-axis, we have economic status. On the left, low income, and on the right, we have high income. And then on the left-hand side, we have a level of mobility, be it low mobility or high mobility. So folks on the far right-hand side, higher income folks, they move to neighborhoods for jobs, for different opportunities. They buy into places or they rent in urban spaces. They move freely at will, so they're unforced to move. In the middle, we have folks that are in the middle income, and largely these are people that don't move as much, largely because they're settling in, they've bought a home, or they're happy where they're renting. There's not a lot of pressure in the urban space that's going to be pushing them out. But on the left-hand side, we have folks that are forced to move. These are largely renters. A few people are homeowners. And this is where people are moving because of a natural disaster, because of rising rent, because of some other kind of local condition that is maybe they lost a job or something like that happened. And we think of evictions falling somewhere further on the left-hand side that highly impacts low-income households, whereas displacement impacts a lot of people. And so we know a lot about these latter 2/3, this middle and far right group, but we know very little about the forced mobility. And thanks to a lot of the research that Matthew Desmond started with the Evictions Lab, highlighting the importance of evictions, we're starting to gather data that actually can help us distinguish between people that are forced to move and versus people that are immobile, as well as other efforts that are going on to collect data on evictions, as well as unforced or informal displacement. So what is precarity? Well, largely you can think of precarity as a fancy term for vulnerability. It's households that are susceptible to suffering and hardship in the event of various shocks or strains. So recession or ecological crisis, like I mentioned before. And the other key important piece is there's this sense of lack of resiliency, this difficulty in regaining or maintaining pre-shock function. So if we are looking deeper at, okay, what is making households and neighborhoods more vulnerable, we need to understand what is the nature of the shock. For example, in 2008, during the housing crisis, that recession highly impacted households that owned homes. And this crisis is highly impacting lower income labor force folks who are in the service sector, essential workers, a different type of group. So it's important to understand how this shock is impacting different groups. There's also personal vulnerabilities. There are certain demographic characteristics that highlight who's more vulnerable. Female-headed households have a much higher cost of living than other folks. And in fact, having children is highly correlated with a higher rate of eviction, especially for incredibly low-income households. And there's also this concept about the precariousness of one's housing situation. How likely are they to be evicted? Did they recently lose their job? Are rents rising in the nearby area? Have they experienced homelessness before or something else of that nature? And then there's also the nature of the housing stock that's available to low-income households. Is there enough multifamily rental buildings? Is there a large amount of poor quality housing stock that low-income households could move into? And finally, precarity is associated with the availability of financial and political protection against such shocks. So is there a stimulus package that can help people rise out and become resilient out of this situation? We find that in our research that unemployment plays a major role in precarity, and therefore this nature of the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic increases the severity of our current recession. Now, when we look at the demographics of folks that are at risk, this is based on a lot of the literature and also a lot of the news that's been coming out, we see that Black and Latinx households are really at high risk. They're more likely to be essential workers. Their exposure rate to COVID-19 is a lot higher. They risk unemployment or seasonal employment. And a recent study just came out talking about how healthcare workers have an 8 times higher risk of exposure to COVID-19, and social care workers have about a 2.5 times higher risk of COVID-19 versus other working labor groups. There's 3 times more infection amongst this population than of whites, and there's also this issue of historical inequalities, issues of segregation, redlining that have led to current circumstances preventing people from being able to own a home and are forced to rent. And so if the renting population is at risk most because of the inability for stable housing, this puts this population to higher risk. I mentioned women already before. There's a much higher rate of unemployment, higher than men, and also the issue if there are children in the household. Elderly are also at a higher risk. And all of these groups have a higher displacement and eviction risk, not only just to COVID-19, but to displacement and eviction. So we focus on neighborhoods, and we are focusing on tracts, census tracts that have a higher than regional risk of eviction, displacement, and unemployment, so that this could highlight underlying population vulnerabilities. And this should be the area that cities should target if they want to target relief towards helping folks from being displaced or pushed out. We have some underlying assumptions based on a lot of the research on neighborhoods. Precarity preceded COVID-19. In other words, vulnerability is nothing new. We can use, therefore, pre-2020 data to identify vulnerability today and make the assumption that these areas are going to be hotspots for precarity, and we can only assume that COVID-19 is exacerbating that and possibly spreading into surrounding areas. We also believe that change is slow, but the pandemic is really fast, and it's increasing the number of vulnerable households. So if we think about the evictions moratorium that's happening, we have a population that's bumping up against this gate of evictions. It's preventing them, but we're adding more people than we usually would on a yearly basis. We also know that the pandemic will hit these vulnerable neighborhoods and populations faster than others. So what we're doing with HPRM research is we're trying to identify which neighborhoods normally have the highest risk of displacement, eviction, and unemployment. And we also have an infection risk data set that we just came up with recently that I might be able, if I have time, we'll be able to talk about. And we also want to identify which neighborhoods will face higher housing precarity during and after the COVID-19 pandemic using machine learning model to predict demographic and neighborhood data. So our pilot study area is the Seattle Metro, and we're also expanding this to the Bay Area, Cleveland, Boston, Chicago, largely because these are areas where we have rich enough data. For displacement, we use a data set from a group called Info Group, which is residential data from 2007 to 2019. And we basically are looking at yearly low-income moves of households. This data set is very detailed, but it hasn't been used too much in scholarly research. It has all of our information. It has our estimated wealth, our estimated race, and a lot of details that will help us try to determine displacement. And displacement in itself, again, is we're focusing mostly on the low-income households that are moving more rapidly than usual in a neighborhood. For evictions, we have a relative risk of eviction, which is at the tract level. We have regional data that is collected by another project that I'm the PI of called the Eviction Study from 2004 to 2017. These are court cases that were scraped using NLP to extract addresses. We estimate the race of individuals, and we have pretty robust data through this time period. And we also use, for unemployment, we use a deep maps model that was developed by Catalyst, which estimates the 2020 unemployment rate for this time period. I'm going to skip over just to save time on these next three slides. This kind of goes into deeper depth about the data itself. It shows a little more about the yearly resident addresses, but some of the issues with these data, for example, with the info group data, is that it over and underestimates some racial groups. It also over and underestimates some wealth categories too. But we're in the process of seeing how far off these data are as compared to census data and to credit score data and a couple other data sets too, to try and help inform and improve our estimates. Again, I talked about the eviction data. Again, these are court records, and like I said before, this is looking at preceding precarity or eviction risk in these areas. We assume that a lot of neighborhoods have characteristics that, even though we see evictions are high in certain areas prior to COVID-19, we can assume that those characteristics are still persistent today. For example, they're in low-income neighborhoods, they're in very diverse or segregated neighborhoods. This is part of the research that we've seen before. And the Catalyst data in itself is also pulling from ACS, current population survey, and local area unemployment statistics data. And it's a pretty broad estimation using PUMS data, and the estimation process is complex, somewhat opaque, but we found it to be one of the best estimates using PUMS data as well as ACS data. So if you're familiar with PUMS, it's a larger than a tract, And there's some detail to it that is scaled down to the neighborhood level that's very helpful. So the first question is, where is precarity persisting? And we've developed a map, which I'll show you in just one second. But before we do, I just wanted to highlight that evictions and displacement are in the same category, but they're slightly different animals. Evictions are just the tip of the iceberg. They occur in low-income areas, affecting very, very low-income households. In fact, they happen in neighborhoods that have the lowest rent in a region. If anyone has read the news in the past 20 years, we can hear that Seattle has been gentrifying for a long time, along with the Bay Area just ahead of it. And so what we know is that there's this competition for certain spaces, and landlords may be willing to evict low-income tenants to try and find tenants that are with higher incomes as they even slightly raise the rents. This slight increase of rent can impact a lot of households. And I'll show you the risk area in one second. But involuntary displacement, it can occur at all income levels. It's largely found to be pushing through informal moves due to rising rents, redevelopment either in the building itself or in the surrounding neighborhood. A natural disaster could impact informal displacement, and even new infrastructures, a new airport, a new train station, a new subdivision being built in certain areas. And what we find is that COVID-19 affects working class households the most, so this is exacerbating housing precarity where people live. So let me see if I can jump out of here and hop into the map itself. This is, I'll forego some of the details. Basically, red is a lot, so this is a relative risk. So this is 3 times greater than the regional average. Everything flows down below 1 is below the regional average. And what you can see is highlighted in red are areas that have a very high risk of displacement. The downtown Seattle corridor, as you can see, is where most rents have been increasing. In fact, some of these tracts have seen, according to Zillow, rents go from $1,000 to $3,000. There are very few tracts, but on average, rent has increased over the past 12, 15 years by about 100% in these spaces. But as you can see down in the south area right here, this is a much lower risk of displacement. In other words, low-income households pushing out faster than the regional average. These are areas where Black households have been displaced to over the past 20 to 30 years, actually 40 years, I'm sorry. Seattle used to be highly segregated. This is interesting because we find that the racial disparity of displacement and evictions is very important. And where folks are heading to is based on what the surrounding city is kind of doing. So rents are increasing in Seattle, they're increasing in the Bellevue area. They're also increasing in areas like Tacoma and Everett. And that's the place where we see displacement. What's interesting is when we pop on the eviction risk, we can see almost a negative relationship where there's very low evictions in Seattle where there's been a high rate of displacement, but there's a high rate of eviction down south where we've seen a lot of low-income households get displaced to. This used to be farmland in about 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, and these are areas where suburbs have been increasing, which is part of a new finding of research that suburbs are seeing a lot of poverty increasing. And so it's important to take into account these kind of structural changes that have happened. Tacoma is also a destination for folks from the Puget Sound region that have wanted to live in near Seattle in that area in the Northwest, but have been forced out because of rising costs. Finally, we can look at unemployment, and we see kind of a positive relationship of unemployment with the eviction risk. And so what these factors detail is where is, unemployment is actually highly related to these concepts of eviction. This little spot right here is the University of Washington, so that's poor students, and there's a lot of unemployment amongst poor students. So I'll go back to my presentation. So a second component that we're trying to do with the housing precarity risk model is, okay, now we know where this risk is located, where might risk increase? And so we look at these characteristics of households. We look at economics, dwelling composition, demographics, race and ethnicity and nativity, education, work, income, migration. These are just a few of the many. And we see that, double check the chat. And we see that, sorry, skipping ahead real quick. The predictive modeling, what we do, just want to run down this real quick, is if we're looking at, for example, the risk of displacement or the risk of eviction or the risk of unemployment. Right now, this model is looking at the risk of displacement as our dependent variable. And we look at the rate of displacement, and you can replace displacement with eviction or unemployment. And we look at that at the census tracts for a specific year, T, which is the info group data for the displacement data. And then we control for neighborhood characteristics, census data at the PUMS level. The data C is in year T equals 2000. So we're looking at 2000 data prior to 2007. And then we also control for county level determinants of outcomes with an error function. So this first step in the training model is we look at our dependent variable of displacement in the year 2007, controlling for characteristics prior to 2007 to try and figure out, okay, what can we, with known data, can we predict out, how well can we predict out displacement in the future based on this model for 2008 through 2019? That's step 2, controlling for prior data to 2007. 2007 is the cutoff because that is the point of data that we have for displacement. And then we compute the percent error. In other words, compare the actual estimates that we predict out from 2007 to 2008 and 19 to our Y and predicted in that position. And so far, our estimates have been pretty close. As you can see, this is looking at Puget Sound displacement using 2007 as a predictor. And controlling for 2000 data. How well can we predict 2008, 9, 10, and 11? In other words, the observed data that we have for these periods of time. And we do pretty well for the first 3 to 4 years, but then things start to kind of, actually we do pretty well up to 2014, but we start finding a lot of outliers. The problem that we find with this is that there are specific characteristics about the year 2013, which is post-recession, that we need to figure out. And that is where we're at with the predictive model. We hope to have within the next month or so a little better understanding of that. And we're also messing with this with the eviction and unemployment data. Real quickly, before we go into the eviction data, I just wanted to ask if there were any clarifying questions.
So there are many questions in the Q&A, but I think that those questions are actually not clarifying questions. I think they're really interesting longer term questions. And I'd like to suggest that you hold off on answering those questions. The questions only go into the Q&A. Hold off on answering those questions, I think, until the end of your talk, so you have time to actually answer them in detail. But if anyone has a clarifying question, they can put it into the Q&A now. But the questions that I'm seeing from Julie Holly, I'd like to hold off on those so that we have time to really answer them in depth.
All right. Well, then I think I should start talking. So hi, I'm Peter Hepburn. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University, Newark, and a research fellow at the Eviction Lab. I want to thank Tim for the first part of this, and to DTI for your support and for the opportunity to present this work. So the research that Tim and the UDP team at Berkeley is doing is, I think it's critical to understanding the places in which housing loss is concentrated, the communities and the individuals that face the greatest risk of displacement. For good reasons that I think we can all appreciate, these models rely on a vision of the world as relatively stable, a sort of ceteris paribus assumption that the predictors of displacement in the past will continue to predict displacement in the future. That is usually a depressingly safe assumption to make. With some important exceptions, given processes like renewal and gentrification, the people and the places that were at risk of displacement 10 years ago are the same people and places in which displacement is concentrated now. Or at least that's how things normally operate. You may well have noticed that things are not operating particularly normally this year in like almost every possible respect. And that is absolutely true of housing and the displacement issue as well. I'm going to start speaking much more in targeted terms about evictions specifically. So these are legal court-ordered eviction cases rather than displacement more broadly. Since March, 43 states have enacted some form of eviction moratorium, and the federal government has actually enacted 2 separate eviction moratoria. That has never been done before. We are in entirely uncharted territory when it comes to eviction in this country. And the truth is that we are flying blind. There are 3.7 million eviction cases filed in this country in a typical year. The federal government collects no data about those eviction cases. There are a few states that do collect and report on these cases, usually with a 1 or 2 year delay. We systematically ignore housing instability in this country among renters. The assumptions that Tim laid out about previous precarious people and places being at high risk of eviction during the pandemic are, I think, very reasonable. But we have no way of checking in real time to see if they're correct. So Matt Desmond established the Eviction Lab at Princeton University to address this lack of data on eviction. The lab has assembled a national database that draws on the court records of about 83 million eviction cases filed across the US between 2000 and 2016. That has allowed us to create the first picture of the prevalence of eviction in this country. That's what you're looking at here. These are eviction rates at the county level across the United States in 2016. Back in March, though, Matt and I were talking about how the lab was kind of ill-suited to respond to the current moment because we rely on these data that are a few years out of date. I suggested that we could maybe do something in real time that would inform policymakers, journalists, researchers, and housing advocates as they attempted to understand eviction and displacement risk during the pandemic. 9 very busy months later, here's what we got. So Tim, if you go to the next slide. So we built what we're calling the Eviction Tracking System, or ETS. The basic idea is this. Around the country, civil courts maintain data systems. Some of these are at the municipal level, most are at the county level, a few are at the state level. Some do not exist online. Some of them exist online, but they're hidden behind paywalls or various restrictions. Some exist online and are free to access, but they contain painfully little data. But there's some of them out there that are accessible and that contain a minimum set of useful data, plaintiff and defendant names, filing dates, addresses associated with the cases. We've assembled a convenient sample of these court systems that we scrape weekly for all new eviction filings. And by we, I want to be very clear that this is a collaborative effort. We stood up the initial build of the ETS mostly on our own, but we have been extraordinarily fortunate to find collaborators across the country to help us to expand this by collecting the necessary data. This is a model for distributed data collection in the social sciences. Once it's in-house, we clean, deduplicate, geocode, and standardize all of this data. In all sites that we're scraping, we have historical data, either directly from the courts or through the Eviction Lab's historical database. That allows us to make a lot of across-time comparisons, which I'll show you in a minute. I also want to highlight that we make all aggregate data from this project publicly available. We update those data every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Fellow researchers are working with the data. They're also being regularly used by large news outlets, including CNN, CNBC, and a number of others. So Tim, slide. At this point, we've got 27 cities that are listed on the website that we built. We display city data on the public-facing site, but we're also collecting data from 9 full states and working on a new display that will allow us to share those data in the coming weeks. At this point, the jurisdictions from which we're collecting data include over 11 million renter households, or slightly more than 1 in every 4 renter households in the United States. Again, this did not exist in March. Slide. I want to give you a quick rundown of what you'd see if you clicked on any one of those cities. So I'm going to use Tampa, Florida as my example. The first thing that you're going to see are weekly filings since March 15th. We mark out times when there was a local or state level eviction moratorium in gray here, as well as the national CDC moratorium that's currently in place, which is in pink. And we also superimpose a trend line on those weekly filing numbers. So next slide. The second plot you'll see shows monthly eviction filings in the site relative to historical average. So as you can see, in January and February, filings were at pretty normal levels in Tampa. They dropped substantially, and they were very low from April through July of this year, and they've been increasing since then. This pattern is pretty typical of many of the sites that we're tracking, although Tampa is one of the few that's now above historical average for new filings. Next slide. Next, we map the data. So here we're showing filings at the census tract level over the last 4 weeks relative to historical filings over the exact same 4-week period. The goal here is to show where cases are unusually concentrated across the cities that we're tracking. And then on the next slide, finally, we provide some data by neighborhood demographics. So here we're categorizing neighborhoods by racial majority using American Community Survey data and showing how eviction filings have been concentrated in certain types of neighborhoods and how that's changed over the course of the year. Next slide. Across the 27 cities that we have on the public facing site, we've tracked 155,774 eviction filings since the start of the pandemic, including nearly 3,200 just last week. That may seem like a lot, and I would tend to argue that it's far, far too many. But I think it's helpful to zoom out a little and to put that into perspective. So on the next slide, this plot is going to show, it shows aggregate weekly eviction filings in the 27 cities as a percentage of historical average for the exact same weeks. This is hopefully kind of a familiar pattern. So roughly normal filings, a little bit above average in January and February of this year, followed by this huge drop in filings as the pandemic starts. That's the vertical red dashed line on March 15th. There's then been this steady increase in filings over the course of the summer and into the fall. We're still well below normal eviction filing levels, but we're headed in the wrong direction. The CDC eviction moratorium that's currently in place expires in 21 days. And I think a lot of us are asking what happens then. I want to draw your attention to those 2 orange bars, 2 weeks in late August. Those are the 2 weeks between when the CARES eviction moratorium expired and when the CDC eviction moratorium was enacted. There were actually just about 10 days, a little under 2 weeks. Landlords moved extremely fast and they filed to evict an enormous number of people in those 2 weeks. We have every reason to expect that the same will start to happen in the 20 days between the end of the CDC moratorium and the start of the Biden administration, potentially at an even larger scale. Next slide. So I want to start to wrap up and leave plenty of time for Q&A, but I want to briefly discuss some analysis that I published yesterday with a colleague at the Eviction Lab, Renee Lewis. In a few of the ETS sites, one of the data points that we're able to collect is the amount that the landlords claim when they're filing for eviction. What you're looking at here are median claim amounts in each month in 4 of the cities that we track as a percentage of median rent in the given county. So let's take Houston as an example here. Median rent down there is about $1,000 a month. Back in January, February, March, the typical claim that we saw was for just over that amount. People getting evicted for a single month of unpaid rent, basically. Over the course of this year, we've seen those numbers go up dramatically. In November, the median case in Harris County, which is Houston, was filed for $1,900, nearly 2 months of rent. Next slide. So I want to stress that this pattern is a wild historical aberration. Here, we're comparing these trends to what we saw in previous years in Houston and New York City. Eviction moratoria do not cancel rent. They simply push the problem to later. When the moratorium is lifted, people owe back rent and they'll owe late fees. What we're seeing out of the ETS is that this problem is going to be enormous. A lot of households are going to owe multiple months of back rent. That's the sort of debt that realistically just cannot be repaid without state intervention. We're working to build a case here for large-scale federal emergency rental assistance. And we're only able to do that because we have these data. So with that, again, thank you for supporting this work. Be happy to take any questions.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much. So we do have questions. I know that Rujna Baichi wanted to ask a question at one point, but there's no question in the Q&A from Rujna. So I'm just going to encourage Rujna to put a question into the Q&A while we address the other questions. There's a bunch of questions in the Q&A from Julie Holly. There's also a bunch of comments in the Q&A, and I think you've probably had a chance to see them. But in terms of questions, here's one. Basically, it's saying sociologists have been tracking poverty in New York City for multiple decades, and the math is simple, but the algorithms fail. And I guess one could say is, what is I'll just keep reading it. If Black Lives Matter, why do we need maps to inform us of housing statistics? structural bias is embedded in economics anywhere. So I think what one can extract from this, a question that is basically saying, what is the role of the models? What is the role of the algorithms? What is the need for this? And also, what is the comment, algorithms fail? And then there's another comment earlier that is about algorithms not scaling. My ground sources are struggling to counter theoretical algorithms which do not scale. So just some comments about scalability of algorithms, I guess, predictability of algorithms, and the need for algorithms. I would summarize the general comments along those lines. So this is an opportunity for you all to opine.
So I'm going to start to take it, and then I'll toss it to my colleagues to talk about algorithms specifically. But I definitely hear Julie's comments, and it's certainly something that I hear a lot. In our work at the Urban Displacement Project, we do what we call community engaged research, and one of our ideas about the research paradigm is that to date it has been too much in a black box, and so that's why policymakers and city governments and so forth are not using data that they know very well exists, because it's not out there and known by the public. So what we try to do is visualize all of our results, post it on the web, and use it as a way to transform community action, so that empowering communities to organize around these data, which then they can push the governments to take action to address some of these issues.
Just to build on Karen's point and kind of reiterate something that I was saying there, you can build on those data when those data are available. And like a big part of our work with the Eviction Lab and with the Eviction Tracking System is simply providing the data into the world. Like, if you cannot see this problem, you cannot solve it. And a lot of what we've been doing is trying to make clear the scale of the problem across the United States and during the pandemic.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that too, that we're at a very base level of understanding evictions. Really, evictions are kind of nested at the county courts or at the state level. And so we know that poverty exists from a lot of qualitative research. And social scientists have just recently got into computational social science. And I will say that even the most low-hanging fruit of understanding the rates, just like Peter was talking about, has massive impacts. In 2019, I testified before the state of Washington House, Senate, and legislature talking about racial disparities in evictions, where in a county that only 9% of the population is African American, 1 in 6 or 18% of the Black population was actually being evicted. So that massive disparity was hidden until we used data science tools to extract the data and process that in a very tangible way, just like Karen was talking about. We use natural language processing to scrape court records now to get the address of where people are getting evicted. We're working on trying to understand the cause of eviction and also the racial disparity. And with the Black Lives Matter movement, it came at a point in time, at a catalyst. And I think that we're at the same kind of peak and point in time where analytics and data science can actually inform a lot of these issues and bring massive change. Baltimore City just last week, in another analysis that we did, just passed a right to legal representation. So these are small wins. In Washington State, they changed the pay or vacate period from 3 days to 14 days after they saw the racial disparity of evictions in that area. So bringing these data to light and making it tangible, making it accessible, I call it the pie chart presentation. I don't like pie charts at all, but sometimes it's that bar graph that shows a massive disparity, just like Peter's bar graphs were showing, can bring massive change. And I think this is kind of the call for sociologists, social scientists, and data scientists, and to get together and start combining our theory and our knowledge and our tools to start breaking open these data sets that are hidden under difficult data, under paper, under pulling them, just like the eviction tracker, has done. This is going to make massive impacts, and this lays the foundation for the argument for change. I think 2021 will be very different. And part of what the Urban Displacement Project has done too is we developed a group called Data for Housing, which is actually training practitioners to use Python very simply, or use machine learning or something, so that the people that have their hands on these very important data sets can actually move beyond the Excel spreadsheet and actually move into understanding what kind of data they have and ask very important questions. They're the ones facing this. So I think that's hopefully that answers that question a little bit.
Thanks. Let's go to the next questions. So Ken Taylor is asking, is there any correlation to evictions and increased COVID cases that may occur in the 2 to 4 weeks after the eviction?
Yes, we're starting to see some research on this topic. There have been a couple of papers that have just been kind of pre-published, looking at the effect of the end of eviction moratoriums and showing that following those moratoria end dates, we see significant spikes in in COVID cases and in excess mortality from COVID-19. And the link here is not particularly hard to fathom, right? If you are removed from your home and you're displaced, you are going to end up doubled up in housing with relatives. At worst, you could end up homeless. These are situations that do not allow for social distancing and for the protective measures that would help to prevent the spread of COVID-19.
So and the follow-up question from Ken says, similarly affected areas of COVID and evictions due to hospitalizations.
Yeah, we don't have enough cause data to allow us to say whether these are individuals who are not paying rent because they're actually in the hospital. But it's an interesting question of whether we could link backwards and look at the reverse causality there.
Okay, the next one, it says, go ahead.
Could I add real quickly, we are incorporating a data set too to try and highlight where the risk of pre-existing conditions for COVID might be, using the CDC's 500 cities data set, and things like asthma or, these conditions are heightened in certain neighborhoods. And we should be able to overlay that with eviction data in the near future.
Okay, super. Okay, the next question is from Jitendra Bagchi. You talked about the cost of eviction to the society being massive. Can you elaborate a little more? So what are the costs that you're talking about? And can you actually assign some monetary estimate of those costs?
That's an interesting question, and I'll let my colleagues weigh in too. I actually haven't seen a study that I really like in terms of taking the costs comprehensively and evaluating that. I've seen there's studies that look at pieces of this. So the costs to upward mobility for children that don't get to continue in the same school and that move into a worse school district because of displacement and eviction. The costs of sprawl and the fiscal costs of building new roads so that when people can't find new places to live within the center city and they move out to the suburbs and then they drive more, and so there's pollution costs and infrastructure costs there. The health costs, there's actually been more quantification of the health and mental health costs of the stress that occurs, and then the resultant heart disease and so forth that is more likely to occur because of the inability to stay in the same house. And then the cost of homelessness too. I mean, that literature is probably the best established. The cost of to the healthcare system of keeping people on the street rather than keeping them in their houses.
Yeah, there's one study that shows in New York City that if you have an eviction on your record, that increases your likelihood of homelessness by about 20%. So like 1 in 5 folks possibly who are evicted. This is in New York City. And that's the second highest predictor of homelessness. The highest one was whether or not you were homeless as an adult. And these are higher than, fleeing domestic violence or if you were homeless as a child. And so there's, a very clear line of succession of what happens both to the heads of household, but also the children in that household too.
Okay, the next, thank you. I think that you don't have any more follow-ups about that. Good. Okay, Jeffrey Geppert says, what are the alternatives to eviction?
That's a great question. And I think we're starting to see, especially during the pandemic, kind of more public policy aimed at exploring the possibilities for those alternatives. For instance, there have been massive expansions in emergency rental assistance programs. So here in New York City, there's a longstanding rental assistance program for those people who are behind on rent and potentially facing eviction for non-payment. We have seen cities, counties around the country use CARES funds to develop such programs, and those can help to stave off a lot of evictions. Mediation between tenants and landlords can be very effective, and we're again starting to see those programs implemented in a number of cities around the country. Milwaukee, for instance, has developed and put into place such a program in the last few months. In many cases, establishing a clear line of communication between landlords and tenants, establishing payment plans, there are remedial steps that can be taken prior to eviction.
So I'm going to switch to Rujna's Baichi's question. That's actually more of a comment than a question, so you can comment on her comment. Data are critical to make convincing decisions. Perhaps this time we should be collecting all the data from welfare offices, HUD, and other similar organizations. Do you want to comment on that, the need for data?
Yes, please.
I've actually worked with HMIS, Homelessness Management Information System data, and tried to link that with housing authority data. And it's very difficult to get those jurisdictions to talk to each other, but I think the first part is convincing them that the data can be linked and that it's possible to make something of those data.
But there also needs to be an incentive structure for making those data available. What we see time and again are that with eviction data, is that they're collected in some form, but there's no incentive for county courts to then process these data in a useful fashion and make them available to researchers, to housing advocates, to policymakers.
And we have particular challenges as urban researchers because, in general, researchers have struggled to get administrative data and then connect across administrative data sets. In those administrative data, they typically remove any spatial identifiers. So it's doubly hard to get anything that is at the address level, which was what the scale that we like to work, because we want to be able to look at the characteristics of specific types of housing units and link that to household outcomes. And we can't do that without knowing where people live. And even with the COVID data is a great example. COVID-19 data, we're struggling even to get it at the zip code level. And the zip code is actually way too aggregate for us anyway. But we can't really make progress in this. We have understanding concentrations of poverty, concentrations of risk, concentrations of vulnerability, and concentrations of COVID, unless we can look spatially at where those concentrations are. So it's extremely frustrating to be an urban researcher. Wonderful and frustrating.
So let me give the next question, which says, is from Dia Win. Is anything being done with the data to actually address the inequities that you are unearthing with the data? So do you want to follow up on that one?
I think Tim's point about testifying before the legislature in Washington state was a great example of how that's working. We've done similar work looking at racial disparities in eviction rates, and we provided those data directly to the ACLU, and they are using those to pursue a series of legal actions across the country. Yeah, we continue to work on these issues. Tim, if you want to jump in there.
So there are 3 more questions. I'm going to try to give you a chance to answer them all, if you don't mind. Are there measurements how the eviction affects the educational path of the children?
There is one study that's underway by an independent group that is attempting to do that. I also have a study in the Houston Independent School District that is doing that. So keep your eyes peeled a couple of years from now.
Okay, no publications yet. Next question from David Hunt. Are the policy approaches for addressing evictions similar to those for displacement, or are these separate policy issues?
I actually see them as a little bit separate because so eviction tends to disproportionately affect those in lowest income households. Displacement is a problem really up through middle income households, people with you know, 2 working adults and who still can't you know, cope with high and rising rents in the cities. And so the issues are a little different, and in some ways it's actually yeah, it's a different set of problems to intervene for a working class, middle class problem of a housing crisis.
Okay. One more question from Clara Narstedt. What would be your suggestion to the state government offices to make it easier for urban researchers to do the data analytics you need to do?
Collect as much data as possible and make it available to researchers in some sort of restricted access format.
Any other follow-ups on that?
There's also, yeah, there's a lot of cost to gathering some of these data, and this is because of archaic rules that were put in place in probably the 80s or 90s. For example, in King County, it costs 25 cents to download 1 page of an eviction record. And I estimated to gather from 2007 to 2019, it would cost close to $375,000 just to download these data. So there needs to be a more open channel in conversation between academics and researchers with policymakers to get access to this, but also to understand that it's possible. It's very possible to do this because we're developing new tools with natural language processing. We can do a lot.
Okay, that's great. And we're up on the hour now. And the last comment there is actually just thanking you speakers for your good comments. That's great. I want to thank you all for being part of our colloquium series. And I want to thank the audience for your interesting questions, and hope to see you in the spring colloquium as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.